For over a century, the Mongol Empire stood as the most terrifying force the world had ever seen. An unstoppable tide of horsemen who swept across continents, burning kingdoms, crushing armies, and rewriting the map of Eurasia. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Hungary, they were whispered about like a storm of vengeance, the horsemen of the apocalypse sent by heaven to punish mankind. When Genghis Khan's riders thundered westward in the early 13th century, Europe stood trembling, utterly unprepared for what was coming. The Mongols were more than just an army. They were a machine of precision, discipline, and ruthless efficiency. Kingdoms fell before them like wheat before the scythe. Russia was shattered. Poland and Hungary were annihilated. Even the mighty Holy Roman Empire felt the shadow of fear stretch across its borders. No force seemed capable of halting them. They moved like ghosts, striking without warning, killing without mercy, and vanishing before their enemies could understand what had happened. To the medieval mind, they were invincible. Beings of nightmare whose arrows never missed and whose horses never tired. But history would prove that even the mightiest empire can fall, not by a single sword stroke, but by time, resistance, and the resilience of those who refuse to bow. This is the story of how Europe finally destroyed the myth of Mongol invincibility. It began in blood. In 1221, Genghis Khan's legions had already obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire and turned their eyes westward. By the time of his death in 1227, his successors carried his vision like divine scripture to conquer the world. Under Ugra Khan, the Mongols surged into Eastern Europe, commanded by Subutai, the greatest general the steppe ever produced. His campaign was surgical, relentless, and terrifyingly effective. In 1241, the Mongols launched simultaneous invasions of Poland and Hungary. At Legnica, in modern-day Poland, the combined forces of European knights, Poles, Czechs, and Teutonic crusaders tried to halt the Mongol tide. But their chivalric valor was no match for Mongol strategy. At the height of battle, Subutai feigned retreat, drawing the Europeans into disarray. Then, as the knights charged, Mongol archers encircled them in a storm of arrows. When the dust cleared, the fields were carpeted with the dead. Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, was among them, his severed head displayed on a Mongol spear. Days later, at Mohi in Hungary, the Mongols did it again. Using night attacks, smoke screens, and perfectly coordinated assaults, they annihilated the Hungarian army. Europe was open, defenseless. The road to Vienna, even to the heart of Germany, lay clear. The invincible Mongols had arrived at the doorstep of Christendom, but then, suddenly, inexplicably, they vanished. The withdrawal was as mysterious as their advance. In 1242, just as Europe braced for destruction, the Mongol armies turned east and retreated across the plains, leaving smoldering ruins behind them. Many believed it was a miracle. In truth, it was the death of Ugra Khan, the great Khan in faraway Karakorum. The Mongol princes were summoned home to elect a new ruler. Europe had been spared, not by its own strength, but by fate and distance, yet the terror remained. The memory of burning cities and slaughtered villages haunted Europe for generations. The Mongols might have withdrawn, but the myth of their invincibility lingered like smoke on the horizon. And that myth would drive Europe to prepare, to build fortresses, to modernize armies, and to learn from the devastation. Over the following decades, Europe transformed. The trauma of the Mongol invasions became the catalyst for change. Kingdoms strengthened their borders, developed new siege tactics, and began to rely more heavily on crossbows, longbows, and professional soldiers instead of feudal levies. The Holy Roman Empire reinforced its frontier castles in Bohemia and Austria. Poland and Hungary rebuilt their armies and formed alliances. Europe was no longer naive. The Mongols, however, were not finished. Under the leadership of Batu Khan and later Mongol Khan, they created the Golden Horde, a vast khanate that stretched across the steppes from the Volga to the Carpathians. For 2 centuries, they ruled over Russia with an iron fist, extracting tribute, enslaving populations, and ensuring no Slavic state could rise without their consent. Yet this domination came at a cost. The Mongols grew rich but complacent. Their once mobile empire settled into the politics of tribute and luxury. While they were still feared, the fire of conquest had begun to dim, and across Europe, the first sparks of resistance were beginning to glow. The turning point came not through sudden heroics, but through the slow erosion of Mongol power. The Mongols, for all their brilliance in warfare, were never suited to governing sedentary civilizations. Their empire fractured under the weight of its own vastness. By the 14th century, the once united empire of Genghis Khan had splintered into rival khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each pursued its own ambitions, often at odds with the others. Internal strife, civil wars, and succession crises sapped their strength. In Europe, the Golden Horde remained the dominant Mongol power, but cracks were forming. The Russians, though still under Mongol rule, began to unite under the leadership of Moscow, a small but determined principality that learned from its conquerors and slowly turned the tables against them. While Western Europe advanced through the Renaissance and new military technologies, the Mongols of the Golden Horde stagnated. Their reliance on the horse archer, once revolutionary, began to falter against disciplined infantry, improved armor, and gunpowder weapons. The Mongols' lightning raids, once unstoppable, found themselves facing fortified towns equipped with cannons and trained defenders. Europe had learned the art of war, and the student was about to surpass the master. The first true challenge to Mongol supremacy came in 1380 at the Battle of Kulikovo. On the plains near the Don River, Prince Dmitry of Moscow gathered a coalition of Russian princes and marched against the Mongol general Mamai. It was more than a battle. It was a declaration that the Slavic world would no longer kneel. The Mongols, confident as ever, underestimated their enemy. Dmitry's forces used deception, discipline, and the element of surprise. In a shocking reversal of history, the Russians defeated the Mongol army. Though the Golden Horde would retaliate years later, Kulikovo marked the beginning of the end. It shattered the illusion of Mongol invincibility, proving that the steppe warriors could bleed and that Europe could strike back. But the true destruction of Mongol power would come in waves. The Black Death, spreading across Eurasia in the mid-14th century, decimated populations from China to Europe. Trade routes, the arteries of the Mongol Empire, became channels of death. The once bustling Silk Road turned silent. The Mongols, whose power depended on commerce and movement, suffered terribly. As cities emptied and caravans ceased, their economic foundations crumbled. Meanwhile, internal wars further fractured the Golden Horde. By the 15th century, it was divided into rival khanates: Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and the Great Horde. Each fought for dominance, draining their strength, and in the north a new power was rising: Russia under the leadership of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, saw himself as the heir of both Byzantine and Slavic traditions. He refused to pay tribute to the Mongols and began consolidating the Russian lands. In 1480, the final confrontation came: the Great Stand on the Ugra River. There, the forces of Moscow and the remnants of the Golden Horde faced each other across the icy waters. No great battle occurred. Both sides watched and waited, but the symbolism was immense. Eventually, the Mongols retreated. Without a single arrow fired, their centuries-long domination of Russia ended. It was the moment Europe, and especially the Slavic world, had been waiting for. The Mongol shadow had lifted, The invincible horde was gone. Europe had endured, evolved, and emerged stronger. Yet the Mongol threat did not disappear overnight. The Crimean Khanate, a Mongol successor state, continued to raid Eastern Europe for centuries under Ottoman protection. Their cavalry raids burned villages in Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine well into the 17th century. But these were the embers of a dying fire. By then, Europe had entered the gunpowder age. Muskets, cannons, and organized armies made the Mongol way of war obsolete. The age of the horse archer, once the symbol of unstoppable conquest, was over. The Mongols' ancient advantage in mobility could no longer stand against fortress walls reinforced by artillery or massed pike formations that turned open plains into killing grounds. In the same way Europe had once trembled at the sound of hooves, now the Mongols trembled at the thunder of cannons. The reversal was complete. The story of how Europe destroyed the invincible Mongols is not one of a single battle or a single hero, but of endurance. Europe survived by learning. Every defeat became a lesson, every invasion a teacher. The Mongols showed Europe the power of organization, communication, and logistics. Lessons that European kingdoms later perfected in their own empires. The Mongol postal system inspired European diplomacy. Their strategies of mobility and intelligence gathering influenced future generals. But Europe did something the Mongols could not. It adapted, industrialized, and unified. The Mongols remained tied to the steppe, to a way of life that could not evolve beyond the horse and bow. Europe moved forward into an age of science, fortifications, and naval power. And when the gunpowder empires rose, the steppe warriors vanished into history. Even so, the Mongols' legacy was not erased. Their conquests connected East and West, laying the groundwork for global trade. The Silk Road they protected carried ideas as well as goods. Through their empire, paper, gunpowder, and the compass reached Europe, tools that would empower Europeans to one day conquer the world themselves. In a sense, the Mongols were both destroyers and creators, both scourge and catalyst. Their destruction of kingdoms forced Europe to unify. Their openness to knowledge helped spark the very innovations that ended them. When their empire finally collapsed, it was not by Europe's sword alone, but by the slow march of progress. The one enemy no conqueror can defeat. By the dawn of the 16th century, the last Mongol Khanates were shadows of their former glory. Russia conquered Kazan in 1552, Astrakhan in 1556, and later subdued Siberia, lands once ruled by Genghis Khan's heirs. The Mongol dream of world conquest was over. In its place stood new empires: Muscovy, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburgs, and eventually the colonial powers of Western Europe. The balance of power had shifted forever. The horsemen who once terrified the world now vanished into legend, and Europe, which once hid behind its castles and prayed for deliverance, became the new master of the earth. But perhaps the greatest victory was psychological. When Europe finally realized that the Mongols could be defeated, that the horsemen of the steppe were not divine, but mortal, it broke a mental barrier that had haunted the continent for generations. The myth of invincibility was gone. The Mongols, who once defined power itself, became a chapter in history, studied and remembered, but no longer feared. And from the ashes of that fear, Europe's confidence and ambition was born. The Crusades had failed to unite Christendom, but the Mongol invasions had done what no pope could. They had forced Europe to evolve or die. And in evolving, Europe found its destiny. From the fields of Legnica to the banks of the Ugra, from the terror of 1241 to the triumph of 1480, the struggle between Europe and the Mongols shaped the world we know today. The story of how Europe destroyed the invincible Mongols is not merely about armies and battles. It is about resilience, about how civilizations rise from ruin, learn from defeat, and ultimately outlast even the most fearsome of foes. The Mongols taught Europe how to fight, how to build, and how to endure. And in doing so, they forged the very world that replaced them. In the end, the empire of the horsemen fell not by sword, but by time, and by the indomitable spirit of those who refused to kneel. For even the mightiest storm must one day pass, and when it did, Europe stood tall beneath the clearing sky, ready to shape a new world from the wreckage of the old.